Welcome, bienvenue, and Anine or bonjour to people. Really happy to have you here as part of our plugged in growing energy literacy and education webinar, the first one of the 25-26 school year. We had a fantastic conference on this very topic of energy education 2 weeks ago with the TDSB and OISE at Evergreen Brickworks, and it was a really great way to get us to do a little deeper dive into this topic, and we're happy to be continuing our learning today. My name is Hilary Inwood. I'm the coordinator of SCAN, the Sustainability and Climate Action Network at OISE, and I work in collaboration, close collaboration with my colleagues at the Toronto District School Board. I'm really happy to welcome them to the webinar. Alicia Roberge, who's the instructional leader, Jen Vetter and Chris Metropolis, who are two members of the incredible team, the EcoSchools team there. And I'm also happy to welcome Sarah Urquhart, who's our webinar coordinator, and Camille Boulot, who is also a member of our SCAN team today too. And welcome to all of you. I'm going to do a formal introduction to Larkin Mosscrop, who is our featured speaker for today in just a minute. But before that, Sarah, do you want to just tell us a little bit? Have you got enough information to tell us a little bit about who's in the room, the demographics?
Yes, we have, I'd say 36% elementary teachers. We have 18% secondary, and a notable number of 27% student teachers. And someone who's connected with community education. So a nice mix today.
Yeah, I can see the faces of many of our teacher candidates in the room. So I'm really pleased to see that. Getting them up and running before they hit their own classrooms is a really beautiful part of the collaboration we do with the Toronto District School Board. So with that in mind, this is what you can expect. We're going to start with a land acknowledgement, then I'll introduce Larkin. And then after she's finished, we'll talk a little bit about some of the upcoming learning events that are coming down the pipe this year. With that, we usually start with an art-based centering of Indigenous voices. So I'd like to introduce you to this beautiful piece. And this does not at all give any sense of the scale of this piece, which is a huge, same size as the side of a school building. It's a really glorious mural here in the city of Toronto, or Te-Toronto, which is the Indigenous name for it. It's by the Red Urban Nation Artist Collective, and it's actually on one of the TDSB buildings at the Bickford Center. It's on Bloor Street in Toronto. The Red Urban Nation Artist Collective, which is known as RUN, was founded in 2017, and it's an Indigenous group of emerging and established artists. It aims to rebuild community bonds and reclaim urban spaces for Indigenous peoples through art, and it's certainly doing a beautiful job of that at the Bickford Center these days. RUN's interior mural and street art projects convey the importance of Indigenous culture and its many teachings, and by infusing public spaces with Indigenous themes, it provides a perfect backdrop, for community members to connect, practice, and share their unique arts and vibrant cultures. You can look up on their website, redurbannation.ca, and you can get more information about this and other pieces. This is actually just part of this piece on the side of the Bickford Center, and it really, for me, helps to reimagine the vibrancy of what could be possible in a world that wasn't struggling with climate change. So thank you to their collective for creating such an amazing mural in our city. I will say, as part of this, that we acknowledge that we're hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas, of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. This is the TDSB's land acknowledgement, which is a good one to start us off today. I will also, though, mention that the best thing we can do after a land acknowledgement is actually to enact the work of decolonization and regeneration and reconciliation. All of those things are important in the work of climate change education. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Larkin Mosscrop. Dr. Mosscrop is a science communicator and researcher passionate about making complex ideas accessible and relevant. Her work focuses on bringing energy literacy into the classroom in ways that are engaging, practical, and relevant to everyday life. Larkin's passionate about sparking curiosity and empowering the next generation to think critically about our shared energy future. So with that, I'd like to welcome Larkin Mosscrop as our speaker for today. Welcome, Larkin.
I am thrilled to be here today. As Hilary mentioned, my name is Larkin. I have been in the energy industry for the past 15 years, but I've been an educator, I'd say almost my whole life. I grew up in the Montessori system and then moved into the public school system. And my mom is a teacher and my sister is also a teacher. And so I think it's in my blood. I've been very fortunate over the last 15 years to teach well over 5,000 students from kindergarten all the way to grade 12, but focused mainly in 6, 7, 8, 9 area in energy, specifically around nuclear as a focus, but also just broadly about energy. I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to then take this into research, into the research arm, and just completed my PhD in energy literacy education in the elementary school classroom, focused on upper elementary. So today, I really wanted to take some time with you to go through what energy literacy is, how I think it can be done in the classroom, how it can be developed in the classroom, and then also to spark some thoughts and some considerations for you as a teacher in the classroom. And then also so very excited to see some student teachers here for how you might take this into the classroom in the future. I am hopeful that there's going to be lots of time for discussion and open questions at the end, and I'm absolutely excited to engage with all of you today. I did include my website here. I will be uploading and including resources there more frequently, as well as some links to things that I, as an energy educator, feel are great resources for teachers, because I know that's always important. So with that, I will try to make my slides work. So what is energy literacy? It's really, it's not as complicated as, people might think in terms of, is it that we can just read about it? Is it how we just understand it? Is information? But really, the US Department of Energy has said it's the understanding of the nature and role of energy in the world and our daily lives, accompanied by the ability to apply this understanding to answer questions and solve problems. So what this really means is we take knowledge, and so that's your information, your facts, your data, and we take that knowledge and we add our values and attitudes. What we're going to be talking about a lot through this presentation is about our values and how that affects the way in which we talk about energy, talk about science, and engage with children about energy. And then with that knowledge and our values applied to that, we then have behavior and action. So these are really the 3 pillars of energy literacy. Although the Department of Energy doesn't talk about these pillars, I think it's really important that we aren't going to create literacy unless we have all 3 of these pillars. So my talk today is really going to focus about these 3 pillars and how you can implement those in the classroom, and also some of my research findings around those. But first, how do we build science literacy, and how do we even build energy literacy or any type of science literacy in the classroom? First, we have to start with information. We're going to go through a few things about information, how we can start to implement that in the classroom. But that information is fundamentally about the knowledge, about having shared understanding. With information, we can move into connection, and that connection is really about how do we build a connection for our students between the information that they're learning in school and applying it to their real world. So this could be something as simple as talking in grade 1 about how many outlets do you have in your house? How many of those are plugged in right now? How many lights do we have? And it's just starting to make a connection between what we're learning in school and what we're seeing in our everyday lives. That connection then helps to build our engagement. Our engagement is when we see the children say, oh, I have 20 outlets and 20 of them are full of electronics. What does that mean for our energy use? So we're starting to see simple connections building into actually having them thinking about, how does this happen in my life? What does it mean if I go to my aunt's house and she has 50 outlets and 40 of them are used? And then also moving into our action in terms of what can we do to change this? So maybe it's we unplug things, maybe it's, oh, we use way more electricity than I thought we did, and maybe that behavior follows. And so again, those 3 pillars, everything about knowledge, values, and behavior, you can see how this build up of literacy is really focused on those 3 pillars. So we're going to talk about each one of these individually, because I think once we capture each one of these, we can see where we can meaningfully insert activities or ideas in order to engage children more. So information. I'm excited you guys are focused in Ontario, but if you were anywhere else, we could talk curriculum anywhere across Canada. But in Ontario specifically, grade 1 starts with energy education. We talk in grade 1 with everyday uses of energy at school, at home. What is an energy resource? And energy is a really complex topic because it's hard to understand. It's hard to think about. It's not something I can touch and feel, but it impacts every element of our lives. We move into grade 5, where it starts to actually look at the energy resource itself. Is it good or bad? Is it green or not? We start to look at the different forms of energy and the different sources of energy, because those are different. We also talk a little bit about energy transformations. And so we're really at that knowledge stage. Once we hit grade 6, we start to focus on electricity. And then the conversation around energy really does continue on this electricity bent for quite a while. Now, this morning I was talking to someone and they said, oh, they start in grade 5. But actually, as I mentioned, we see energy all the way from grade 1, 2, 3, all the way through to grade 12. And really what this slide is here to emphasize is that this is all about facts and knowledge. How do we have an understanding of the fundamentals and the basics of it? The OECD actually defines science literacy as the ability to take knowledge and combine observations to make decisions about our world. And that's where this knowledge piece is essential, but we really need to start to see observations. And in things like energy, it's hard to observe without having a little bit more context built around it. So when we move into information, what I encourage us to do is to consider this. This slide is full of terms and jargon. And this vocabulary is important. But actually, I'm going to say something that may or may not be a popular opinion, and that is that renewable energy, that term renewable, actually means nothing. Renewable on what time scale? Renewable in what way? Are we approaching this with climate perspective? Are we approaching this with environmentalism? Are we approaching this with waste considerations? So the term renewable usually means that it is a self-sustaining. So solar power, for example, is known as renewable. However, on what time scale? If we talk about a year, absolutely. 100 years, absolutely. I'm sure the sun eventually will burn out. And if we look at that time scale, perhaps it's no longer renewable. We can speak about the same way, probably a bit better with biomass. In one day, it's not renewable. In 1 year, also not renewable. And 10 years, it likely is. And so this term renewable is something that shows up in every single curriculum across Canada in many times and places. And yet it itself has no meaning. And so I wanted to highlight that, do we need these terms? Are they important? Do they matter in themselves, the term, or is it the concept that matters? And if it's the concept that matters, what I wonder is how do we convey these concepts in a way that allows children to say, okay, I think I understand what this energy transformation is, why this energy transformation matters, because each one of these is an energy transformation where we're taking chemical or radiant light and moving it into electricity production. Do we need to even have these terms? And is there a way that we can talk about things in a way that allows students to understand the actual concept rather than just a term? So I would challenge you, when you are teaching about these things, to ensure that the concept is what gets applied and not the focus on a term. My research actually showed that students could engage in very complex conversations around energy without understanding the fundamentals. it was very clear through my work with grades, it was grade 6, 7, 8, and 9, that the understanding of the forms of energy, energy transformations, even sometimes about categorizing energy in alternative, conventional, renewable, non-renewable, that understanding wasn't necessarily there, but yet we could have really complex conversations about how energy could apply in their world and in their space. There's also been research that supports that we can change the amount of knowledge and it will have no impact on their values or their beliefs or their actions around that. But we can also simultaneously have an effect on their values and beliefs without increasing knowledge. And so this is where I really want to transform the way we think about the facts that we apply in our classroom and focus more on that connection piece. And this is where we start to look at connection. For example, if we had this focus on renewables, and I promise just because I'm in nuclear does not mean I don't like renewables. It's a great example. If we have this focus on renewables, and I've shown this exact slide to many students, they say, but wind takes up a lot of space. It has a really large ecological footprint, but it's got a really low carbon dioxide footprint. So what does that actually mean? How can a renewable be so different? It has a large ecological footprint, low carbon dioxide. And again, this is where connection makes so much difference. Where and how are we approaching how we're teaching about this? In what way are we teaching? Which is the way the curriculum is sort of written, we're teaching renewable good, non-renewable bad. We're not really telling the full story. We're relying on jargon to transmit an idea instead of carrying an idea without that jargon. And so I draw students to think about, well, what about we look at hydro? What about biomass? How do we associate this clean energy that we have a lot of in Canada? And what would we do? Many students would say, well, we can just use biomass for energy. Great, let's look at how we can actually do that. How's the ecological footprint and what matters to us? What are the ecology impacts comparatively to carbon? Does it matter in Canada when we have so much space in comparison to, say, a European country where there's less? And so when we start to build and help build these connections to this complex topic, not focused around a term or jargon, but focused on these ideas and this concept, you can see how students could actually start to think about energy very differently. And that's really ultimately what I care about as an educator, is that I want someone to walk away thinking about energy differently, no matter what age they are or what grade they are in, is they've learned something that changes the way they see the energy or the way energy exists in their space. I really want to bridge that information, making it more than just learning of a term to giving it context and giving it legs within their real lives. And so this is what I propose that we do, is build connection with these material. Information is important for us to have the baseline understanding, but then we can build connection. And in fact, it started off this conversation today talking about Indigenous art, which I really love, and I took a note to bring that back, but also about this idea of two-eyed seeing. Two-eyed seeing is about the idea of us seeing with both lenses, seeing with Indigenous ways of knowing, as well as the Western way, or seeing multiple perspectives and building those connections with one another. And in fact, building connection is really what two-eyed seeing is about. And I think it's such a relevant concept to education, because we want to make connections. We don't want a student who can tell me what the term renewable means without understanding why it matters to them. It could start as simple as looking at this bottom picture, the electricity consumption in our homes, and having students think about how much energy they really use, how they could change the amount of energy they use, what appliances use a lot of energy, diving deeper into figuring out the pieces of their lives where energy impacts them. We can also explore different concepts and different ideas. This North America's biggest sources of electricity is one of my favorite slides, and it's because it starts to have a conversation about energy policy in grade 4, 5, and 6. Can you imagine being able to have a conversation about where we could have different infrastructure, where we could build different types of energy, all within one picture? And that's exactly what I did during my research is I said, what do you see? What is interesting to you in this picture? And they said, oh, that there's wind energy that produces most of the electricity in some of these states. Well, why is that? What do we think? And then we talk about geography. And then when we talk about hydro in Canada, well, hydro, why do you think hydro in Canada is so big? And then we talk about economics and social, and we talk about different sizes of the countries and how that could impact our amount of energy required and maybe the way in which we can source energy. And so by doing this, we are taking science and saying it actually is everywhere. Science is not just this science class that I have allocated. It is actually in geography, it is in social sciences, it is in English, because we're learning in English or French, depending on what school you're in. And we're able to tie it and make some connections with students. We're not forcing that connection. They're building it through just a simple observation of the sources of electricity. So we're allowed to explore ideas that don't fit in this science bubble. And I think it's so important that we get outside of that science bubble, because science has for too long been known as for the elite, for the smart kid in the class. But in fact, science is everywhere. Science is naturally made for us as we're all curious from birth. And so building these connections and diving deeper is so important in making science more than just this one activity. So then we move into engagement and action. So those final little up and down of our roller coaster. Energy is a social issue. Energy is also a really good way of talking about something that can get people fired up. I talked about the fact that I'm a nuclear scientist. And so people can get pretty excited when they talk about energy, much like an electron when they are producing energy. You can use that anytime you want. But we want to get kids to come from the facts around energy into building something that matters to them. I want them to say, I wonder if, or I think I didn't know that about energy. I didn't know that about nuclear. One of my favorite pieces of my research was at the end, I asked each kid, what is something that you learned? Each child, what is something you learned? What is something you didn't know? And a lot of them actually were talking about that energy picture of the United States and Canada. A lot of them talked about how ecological footprint and climate are very different. A lot talked about just very random pieces of the just conversation that we'd had, that their peers had taught them, that we had talked about, that we discussed. They didn't see it as a social issue, but really just thought of energy as the electricity that they have when they turn on a light or play a game. And so at the end, it's this idea of, if we can get a child to think, how does my access to energy impact my choices and my behaviors? We're already getting them to think for policy decisions that they will be part of in the future, if not now, when they talk to their parents. And then moving into that action piece is, are there things I can do to change my behavior, to reduce my use of energy? And does it matter? Do I need to? Those types of things allow students to then take ownership of their own learning and their engagement with material. And to me, if that happens, it means they've made it. They are energy literate, and they may not be able to tell you the terms, but they understand the concepts. So to build energy literacy, I want to talk about language. Language really matters when we talk about science literacy in general, but energy literacy specifically, because it's not tangible. It's not something we can touch and feel, but it is something that can be pretty scary. So we need to make it accessible by using words that are simple, contextual, and allow students to engage meaningfully. Doesn't matter that we know that radiant means light, or if we can just use light, right? We also need to frame energy as not just black and white, or just about electricity, or just about good or bad. We need to frame energy in a way that's about conversations. And that leads us into the connection piece again. And I will reiterate connection all the way through. And it's because it's the most important part. If we can get connecting between the material we're learning to the students' lives and community, then you have built energy literacy. And that's because they start to see themselves in community and the community affected, and they want to understand what they can do. And even if the student pretends like they don't actually care, they'll still be like, well, maybe I'll ride my bike more, right? And so, or maybe in 10 years, they'll think to themselves, okay, I remember this, I should ride the bike. And I want to ensure that we're encouraging inquiry. And I know inquiry-based learning is so fundamental to a lot of the curriculums across Canada. And I think the problem that we have is inquiry needs to be led. It is not a program that is go research this topic, figure it out, and then come back and tell me about it. It is a guided, led exercise where there's engagement from the teacher and engagement from peers to lead that inquiry, especially when we're talking about elementary, but even into the upper grades, there still needs to be some sort of guide to understanding, helping those connections, building those connections, understanding the path, because we all know that online there's a lot of information that is not correct. And so it's important that we guide this inquiry, especially in the earlier stages. And finally, this engagement with teachers, which is why I'm so delighted to be here today. My objective for my thesis was really to get teachers in the room, to work with teachers to build science and energy literacy with them in their classrooms. So we need to create resources, and that's one of the mandates I have for myself over the next few months, is to really put those together and put them available for teachers to use. So again, I will be doing that, and I'll make sure that link is shared. And then also to share information, what worked really well. I have the absolute honor to have got to speak to and teach over 5,000 students. And so I know what hits and what has not hit to a student. And so I am happy to share that information and work with people to engage in a more meaningful conversation around energy. I'm working with some First Nations on energy literacy education for First Nation on reserve schools. I really think the most important thing is we all share together. And then also to offer learning opportunities. And I think OISE and TDSB have done that here by offering this learning opportunity. So now I'm going to move into a little bit more of discussion around our values and how we learn how to teach and how our students learn, and then how we learn it and really what that means for what we learn. It's a little bit more theoretical, but I think it might change the way you approach energy in the future in your classroom. So first, I'll start with some factors that I know to influence science education. The curriculum, of course, it lays out what, it lays out how, I'll say. I will preface that I have not attended Teachers College, so I do know what happens, but I have not participated in that. I have reviewed every curriculum in Canada from all the provinces, grade 1 to 12. And so I do have some basics of curriculum, I'd say. Curriculum tells us the what. It tells us the big ideas, especially in Ontario, followed by some smaller ideas. I've also had conversations with teachers that say, yeah, but depending on your time, you could cover a big idea in a day. Absolutely, you could. I've seen it. And that goes into teaching practice. What we do in our classrooms and how we can manage our classrooms is not always up to us, to be fair. Our classrooms, and I will fully give every teacher here amazing praise for the fact that our classrooms are sometimes you need to figure out what you're going to teach on any given day, mainly based on how the classroom is focused and paying attention that day or participating that day. And so that teaching practice is influenced, of course, by what's going on in the classroom. And it needs to be, because we need to still build on literacy. But I would encourage us to build on literacy using science. And then we need to focus on student beliefs and values, as well as our own, which I will focus a lot on in the next slide. But those affect how we teach science. Students thinking that science is for the elite makes them not pay attention to science class. I'm not the smart kid. I don't really need to do well in science. I'm never going to do science. The fact that in grade 10 can be your last science class. As a scientist, I find crazy, but my sister last took science in grade 10. And so I think that encouraging students to see science differently is really important, because that affects the way science education happens in the classroom. And then finally, the media. And I think the media is why connection and context is so very important over facts, because facts may be presented differently. And although they shouldn't be, the media affects the way in which people perceive science. I want to link back to the values piece. And I really want you to think about your position here. I want you to think about your own values and how you teach energy or science more broadly in the classroom. Do you think about climate justice? What about the environment? Intersectional environmentalism? Do you think about social issues when you're teaching science? How does your position affect the way in which you show up for science in the classroom? And I say that because I come from a climate justice perspective, and I think when I think of energy, I'm speaking for the planet. And so although there is a lot of socioeconomics behind energy, I'm speaking for the planet. And so when I teach about energy, I'm really focused on those who cannot speak for themselves. And so because of that, I approach education very differently in energy specifically, because of my feelings towards energy. But I also want to remind all of us, but also pull back to that idea that we started with, of the two-eyed seeing, of integrating multiple perspectives to build connection. Our own teaching is influenced by our values and beliefs. And without responding, though I'm happy to see it in the chat if you feel like putting it in, I want you to think about a few things. The first is, do you support nuclear power? And either way, yes or no, how does that influence the way you teach about it? I had the great luck, I'll say. There's a couple elementary school teachers in here, so they'll feel me. I love elementary school students, especially grade 7, 8. That's an unpopular opinion, but I got the privilege of teaching 3 grade 3 classes back to back to back. The first class comes in and they are so pumped to be there. They know they're learning about nuclear science and they are like all over the moon. They know the elements of an atom already. They know what nuclear fission is. They are so excited to tell me that about all the things they've learned about nuclear. Their teacher says, I'm a science major. I love energy, and the kids just love it. We do science forever, and they love it. And it was electric. Another class comes in right after, and the kids were quiet. They didn't engage. They didn't seem to really care. And they're in grade 3. And I thought, oh, it starts already. The difference between the teacher who loves science and is getting excited about it for their kids versus the teacher that doesn't really like science, either because they don't understand it or because they just don't like science, maybe it wasn't something they did ever, affects the kids in grade 3. And what does that mean for the child in grade 4? What does that mean for the child in grade 12? And I think it's so important that we don't lose that. The next question I want to ask you is about um, what about EVs? What about electric vehicles and that mandate? What does that mean for how you teach about electricity, fossil fuels, the energy grid? Do you understand how it connects to the energy grid? How does your feeling about something affect the way it's taught in class? And it absolutely is going to. I know it affects the way I teach, so it absolutely will. But the important piece, and this is where this very scary indoctrination word comes in, and it became a big part of some of my research because I had to check myself on, am I conveying my values or am I conveying values? Because energy is a social issue. Energy has social aspects. And so we can't, and that energy literacy pyramid, values is a part of it. Values and attitudes are framing how we talk about energy and are required for us to be energy literate. So we can't get away from it. We can't just say, we're never going to talk about values in classroom because we have to. But how do we do that? Especially in topics that are morally pluralistic. And, at the beginning, Hillary said, talk like a human, not like an academic. And so that morally pluralistic idea is that there's multiple, often conflicting moral values around and perspectives around a topic that can all equally be valid. And so in any situation, when it's indoctrination versus education, is really if we are imposing our own values or if we are still open to and speaking about multiple perspectives. And that's how we stay in that education realm and away from indoctrination. Is although we have our own values around the way in which we understand a topic, we are open to conversation. And so although I am pro-nuclear, I will have conversations forever about the terrible sides of nuclear as well as the positives. And I will have conversations about how it might fit in or where it might not fit. And those values that I have are about building literacy so that children can come to their own decisions. Students in this case, I had some students who were talking about fossil fuels with me. And I had a student who says, Larkin, I don't think that you can stop using fossil fuels. And I think people think really poorly about them. And I don't think it's warranted. And I said, okay, let's talk about that. Because the whole class was like, no, you have to stop fossil fuels because it's bad for the climate. And she said, absolutely, it's bad for the climate. But other types of power can be kind of expensive. And if you need a lot of heat, it's hard to do with solar and wind. Like you can't do it. There's a type of solar that you can get a lot of heat from, but we weren't there yet. And so I think you need to be able to burn fossil fuels for industrialization and economic growth and sustainability around food. And I said, absolutely. And so it's this idea that our values around energy depend on what we're focused on. So that was just a good story. That student was in grade 7. So you can be always amazed at what comes out of students' mouths. And so I end with bridging the science gap. And how do we do it? Education in the classroom needs to focus on a competency-based education, which means that we are looking at a more personalized approach, moving away from memorization and answering questions, because my research has shown that is not a meaningful representation of what a student can discuss and understand around energy. And moving towards the behaviors of science. The other day, I was thinking about the fact that we call it the scientific method. Method is a methodology. It's a behavior. It's an approach. We don't call it the science, fill in the blank. And because of that, I really want to encourage the shift away from a positivistic lens that is so inherent with the deficit model, which is that you just don't understand the facts. Once you do, you'll understand it, you can move on, you can apply it, to one that is about how can we encourage students to just explore with curiosity? How can we encourage ourselves to move away from even our own beliefs and push through and support curiosity and perspectives and different ideas? The emphasis in science needs to be pedagogical and moving away from positivistic. There are so many different types of ways of engaging with science in the classroom. And I think that all of them have a different purpose, but observations around science can actually allow us to increase our accessibility and be more inclusive. If a student is having trouble with reading and math, but they can do a science experiment, they can hands-on touch, feel, observe. And as a teacher, we can see how they're touching, feeling, observing. They don't need to write that down for us to understand that they understand that scientific method. And I think if we encourage students through just grace to understand and feel excitement about something that they're working on and doing, and allow them to have that time to learn themselves, we can really move beyond where we are right now in science education to a better place for science literacy. And with that, I am done my prepared slides, but I really wanted to emphasize that we need to build connection. No matter what the area is in science, without connection for our students, we are not going to be able to build energy literacy or science literacy. And so in the future, when we have hard things happen, and we're going to with climate change, when we have hard things happen and we need students to show up and understand and make decisions, we won't have the ability to do that. And so I encourage everybody to think differently about how you approach education, specifically science and energy. And I hope this wasn't too theoretical, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Larkin. I have encouraged people to pop their questions into the chat. And I will say it's lovely to hear a science educator talking in some of the same terminology that we do in the arts. I'm an art educator by training, and that's about notions of exploring values as part of our teaching and learning in our classrooms, and thinking a little bit about engaging students, getting them excited, and talking about different multiple perspectives. I think all of those are really valuable, and not what I was expecting to hear in conversations around energy education, which is fantastic. One thing I'm going to guess that some people would like to hear, certainly I would like to, is some sample activities. Can you give us some ideas of the types of activities you've been doing with students to engage them in conversations around energy?
Absolutely. So the big one, I did show one of them on the slide, the map of North America, and talking about different types of electricity and energy and why that matters. And I think that one has been an absolute success in any grade. You can really use that anywhere. I have used it from K to 12. The little guys, the little ones, there's a lot of really great stories about energy. And so different types of energy, different ways of engaging. So I'll read a story usually around electricity and energy production. And then I have some touch and feel boards that we kind of add different things onto. We have some Velcro patches that I've kind of drafted, and we build stories together around electricity and energy transformation and ideas. The other one is with older kids. I will actually share this reference. It's hard to find, so I will find it and give it to you. But it's a phenomenal game about the grid. So the electricity grid is something most people don't understand. It is, I would say, like most adults don't understand the electricity grid and how complicated it is. And this game was developed that actually is a very simple game to put together, and it's a grid. And you have pieces that you add onto the grid. And what you have to do is you have to fill the grid perfectly. You can't have things over, and you have costs for each type. You have climate implications for each type. And people start to think about, how do we fill this grid in the best way with what we have? And why that's kind of fun also is then you can say to your students, okay, let's come, what's a random rule that we want to come up with? And somebody said, we're going to do the Texas rule. So we're going to try to do the highest carbon dioxide we can for this grid. And so the kids can kind of engage and see what they can do with the different grids and how that might apply to them. So that one's a really good one as well.
Is that one online or is that a commercial game?
No, it's online and it's free to print.
Okay, so you're going to find that.
I'm going to find it because I don't want to direct you in the wrong place. So I will find it and I'll make sure it comes out in our resources.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. As well as a couple of my favorite books, because for the elementary school teachers, and even if you aren't, they're a great story, especially if you break out your voices, which I absolutely encourage when you're talking about coal.
But. Fair enough. Fair enough. I mean, I don't know if people heard last week, we hit a new milestone in that there was more. Now, I'm going to use the term renewable because that is still the one that I'm quite used to using, even though I hear your concerns about the term. That we are now producing overall worldwide more energy through renewable energy sources than we are from coal-fired plants, which is a big thing. Yeah, that's pretty exciting, I think, in this case. Okay,
and I think on that same note, it's so important with energy, especially, it's changing so much right now. And there's some really exciting things you can do by bringing in the news to the classroom to talk about energy. There's so many fun things that are happening. Students can get excited by seeing like, oh, the thing I'm learning. Then they go home and get to talk about it to their parents. So it's like a double whammy when you're teaching them. And then they go and they're like, did you know that this happened that this is happening? That they committed to tripling nuclear power by 2100 or something like that. And then it sparks more conversations. And so pulling the media in really does help us with engaging too.
I'm just popping into the chat, the Drawdown Explorer. I don't know if people have come across Project Drawdown yet. It's fantastic. And it's a really neat way to explore, to be fair, not just energy sources, but other ways of solving climate change. But energy does definitely play into this. And it's a really interesting tool to use with your students. They've just launched it a couple of weeks ago. So that might be of interest to people too. Are there others with questions for Larkin? Oh yeah, Alicia, I can see your hand up.
I really liked the fact that you brought in place into the conversation as well, how that complicates like what kind of energy source you're going to be using, and even like looking at climate change occurring now and how that's changing climate, and like how that complicates also, what energy sources we use as well. Have you used that in the conversation in the classrooms? Like, what does that look like when you talk about that?
Yeah, actually, it's so fun when you start having that conversation, because it's something like in Canada we use a lot of hydro, right? You can tell a Canadian anywhere because we call it hydro, not electricity, and hydro. But also we have a lot of water. So if you live somewhere that doesn't have a lot of water, how could you do that, right? How does that limit you? In Nunavut, it's mostly diesel. And so could any other spot be mostly diesel in North America? No, because of just populations and density. And so then we start talking about, say, China's a really great one. I love this example because China has pledged to be net zero by 2060, but they are putting more coal-fired plants on board every year. But they're actually also growing the most clean energy by year as well. And so when you hear that China is continuing to do coal power and building more and more coal power, you immediately think, oh, that's terrible. We're going to have like way more climate implications from this build out of coal. But then you also simultaneously hear about the fact that they're actually increasing renewables more and green energy more and faster than any other country in the world. And so when you start to think about place, it's not just geography, but it's the populations that are there. And what does that actually mean? And how can you have those two seemingly conflicting ideas? Why would you need more coal if you're also building out so much renewables? Those two seemingly conflicted ideas is really because of population density. We couldn't do both of those things and use enough energy in Canada, for example. And so it's hard for students, especially in Canada, to conceptualize just the amount of energy some other nations need. And so that's why I think place is so important, because in Canada, we think about energy in a different way. We use a lot of energy, most of our energy, in fact, for transportation here in Canada, because we're such a big country, and we have to transport all of this energy, like all of our supplies. But a lot of other countries have a very, very small amount on transportation. And so bringing in place allows us to build context. I hope that answered it.
Well, it does. And I'm thinking too that the conversations that teachers have in their classrooms in Alberta are probably very different from the conversations we have right here in Ontario, which is a mostly clean energy grid. So
absolutely.
That absolutely complicates things for
Thank
sure.
you.
Yeah. Are there other questions from audience members? It does strike me that the way you've positioned this as a values-based conversation and sort of situating it in the learning is that it becomes easier to take it across the curriculum. It doesn't have to, I mean, I know you've talked a lot about science education, but it doesn't have to say only in science.
Yeah.
But by reading storybooks about energy, we can bring that into language arts. I've been experimenting myself with solar-powered approaches to making art more recently, which is kind of fun too, using solar dyes. And that would be a great way, I think, to bring it into the visual arts curriculum. So there may be other ideas. If people in the room have ideas about how to do this and you've tried things out, please put your hand up. We'd love to hear how you're doing it in your classrooms too.
I did want to echo what you just mentioned, and I think it's so important, and I say it all the time, is science is not just for our science class. And science needs to be across the curriculum. And even if it's that your reading for that day is science, perfect. Because what happens is that because of our assessment-based system, we focus so much on literacy and numeracy, and absolutely love math. I love math, actually. I was never an English major, so I will say I don't love that, but I would love to have done more science reading. And so building in science across, and that's also why I hesitate to have science only teachers, because I think science needs to be across our entire curriculum, not just in science class.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I will say that the TDSB has been, it is working towards a really progressive stance on this. And Alicia might be able to speak a little bit more about this, that the TDSB is planning to release utility data for all of its schools.
Cool.
Do you want to mention a little bit about that? Because we're going to do a whole webinar on that topic in the new year.
Yeah, so we already have the utility data on our website. So if you are a TDSP teacher, you can access like how much your solar panels are generating. You can see how much greenhouse gases your school has generated. You can also see how much you're saving as well. So there's tree data as well. Like there's so much there that you can use in the classroom and curriculum and use cross-curricularly across like any subject area. But like Hillary said as well, like I really think it is important too. And like you said, the cross-curricular, like really diving deep and looking at different subject areas and looking at it from all those different angles is so important. Yeah. In these conversations, definitely.
We've got a couple more questions in the chat that maybe we can just take these last two before we wrap up.
Sorry. Yeah.
Suman asks, because there's so many values and beliefs that relate to this work, how do we navigate this notion that all answers or every answer is valid?
I think it's that every answer is not valid. Every answer needs to be heard and considered, and then observations and information need to be used to have a conversation and build that science and evidence-based response. And so if somebody is saying that oil and gas is the only way forward for countries, for example, that is maybe a belief they hold. But when we look at evidence-based different uses of energy in poorer countries, in different countries, in countries with different types of populations, different cultures, etc., we can look at, okay, here's the evidence that we have. Does that actually align with your belief? And I think that that's what science is all about it doesn't, just because you have one answer right now does not mean it is the answer. And so then we have to learn that critical education piece of taking the information that we have and testing our own beliefs. And so having a value, and I think that's important, is that having a value base does not mean that what I believe is right. Right. It means that it needs to be part of the conversation, or should be part of the conversation, so that we can have a conversation. Because I think people are so scared about having conversations. And I think we need to move away from being fearful of a conversation and welcome those discussions around where they're coming from. And I've had so many conversations with people who are super anti-nuclear, and they come to me and we say, okay, let's talk. Let's figure out where we're at. And then I come a little bit on their side, they come a little bit on my side, and we somehow make a little bit of a difference towards our understanding of energy.
You're right, though, that notions of misinformation are just so critical these days.
So critical.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Operating, sadly, by being encouraged by a certain president south of the border, where the outright lies are accepted and not challenged.
Absolutely.
It's huge.
Yeah.
Yeah. In a different direction, our last question is from Jessica. And Jessica says, have you been able to make connections between energy education and land-based or outdoor education? And if so, what did that look like?
So it's something I'm working on right now a lot, especially with the connection with land-based learning and traditional knowledge. And I think it's something I'm still working on. So I will have materials about this in the future. But really it's about thinking about ecology, which is my background really, and thinking about the ecosystem and speaking up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And how does that look for energy production? And so I do connect with those quite a lot, but I'm looking at developing some resources around specifically that. And so they should be available within the next kind of few months.
It's a fantastic question, Jessica. I know that Indigenous Climate Action, which is an NGO from out west, is doing work in terms of helping community, First Nations, Indigenous, Inuit, Métis communities move towards clean sources of energy for their communities, which are often remotely positioned geographically, and that they've got some resources on their website. So Indigenous Climate Action is one of the groups that you can look to see what's happening in that area. And in fact, Jessica, you've done a fantastic segue in many ways, because our next webinar in a couple of weeks will in fact be on land-based education. So maybe that's a question we can ask our speakers from the Urban Indigenous Education Center as part of that. Could I ask you to join me in thanking Larkin for her time today and sharing her expertise with us? Larkin, thanks so much. This has really been great. I am not an expert in energy education or energy literacy, so I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us today. That's been wonderful. And I will say that we've got a couple of upcoming events for those who might like to share. I'm just going to, Sarah just triggered the exit poll. Thank you so much, Sarah, for doing that. I'm just going to pop up the slide deck one last time. We haven't got the exact date nailed down yet. We hope to very shortly, but there will be a webinar coming up in late November with the Urban Indigenous Education Center on land-based learning. So we look forward to welcoming Tanya Senk and members of her team to that. And we'll get the information out to you, everybody, about that coming up. And then we've also got one of the OISE SCAN webinars, which is actually on early childhood education and looking at what early childhood education looks like when we intersect that with climate change education. So thank you so much for joining us all today. And we will send you out within about a week a link to the recording and a list of resources from our speaker and also from the EcoSchools team. Thanks, everybody. Great to see you today. We'll hope to see you again at a future webinar.